Creativity is to do with thinking differently, thinking out of the box. And I think it's something to which we all aspire as teachers for ourselves as well as for our learners. And it doesn't make any difference whether we're teaching preschool, kindergarten, primary, secondary, adults, tertiary students, or business. The same things apply. But at the same time, I think creativity is not something that's always valued in the contexts and schools that we work in. And here's a little story to illustrate this. And this story is about a boy called Eddie at school. And he's a bit of a misfit, and he's a bit difficult. And actually, he drives the teachers mad. And this is the kind of thing that Eddie does, okay? Because one day the teacher says to Eddie, well, how many days of the week begin with the letter T? And Eddie thinks and thinks and thinks, and the teacher thinks, oh, come on, come on. And eventually Eddie says, 2. And the teacher says, well then, what are they? And Eddie says, today and tomorrow. And then the teacher says, well, here's a little maths question for Eddie. I'll catch him out this time. How many seconds are there in a year? Quick as a flash, Eddie replies, 12. The teacher looks. Yes, January the 2nd, February the 2nd, March the 2nd, and so on. The teacher thinks, okay, well, here's a little spelling test, Eddie. Can you tell me, please, how many D's are there in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? Eddie thinks, and the teacher can see him computing in his head. And suddenly he goes, 103. And the teacher says, how do you get that? Easy, says Eddie. Da 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 da. Okay, that story is not my story. It's a story quoted actually by Nick Owen in his book, The Magic of Metaphor. And it originally comes from a story by John Grinder in the book called Writing the Educational Conveyor Belt. And he actually uses that story to show how so often in educational contexts there is a culture of right answerism rather than thinking differently and being creative. And creativity, of course, to do with new, novel, fresh ideas, artifacts, products, solutions to problems, or even the formulation of problems themselves. Okay. And actually, when we think of that, we might like to look at this quotation here. Creativity, that's something that is increasingly needed in our educational context that we work in. And if you read this quote here, you might think, yes, this comes from a book on digital literacy, digital skills in the 21st century. I'm not going to read it out, but the importance of creativity, I think, there is obvious. But in fact, it's not from a 21st digital literacy skills book. It's by Jean Piaget, and this was in an interview at the end of his life towards 1980. There's just one thing that I've added to that quotation, and that is the words and women. Because unfortunately, although we're almost 90% female audience here, we weren't kind of in the running in those days, in the end of the 1970s. But I think what Piaget was saying then is just as relevant as it is today. I think we sometimes think because of the digital revolution, it's because of technology that we need more creativity. And indeed, it is true that technology provides us with the tools and the possibilities for individualizing our learning and our students' learning and leading to more creativity. But this is something that has been important for many years. And to start off with, what we need to have is engagement. Engagement of our students. That this, for every teacher, is the starting point. And engagement is to do with that involvement and intensity of learning that leads to observable progress. There's a lovely quote by Griffiths and Burns that talk about engagement as being the fertile soil from which sustainable learning grows. So it's to do with that emotional intensity and involvement. And when we have that, of course, that leads on to flow. Flow, which I'm sure many of you will recognize, is the concept developed by Csikszentmihalyi, originally in the context of working with sportsmen and to do with sports performance. And flow is to do with harnessing the emotions in the pursuit of a task and a particular outcome. It's that kind of internal feeling, I want to do this, I can do this, I'm going to succeed. This motivation from the inside. It's the kind of thing that actually years ago, when my own daughter was at school, she would say to me, "Mummy, I'm on a roll with my essay." Okay, so motivation from the inside rather than the carrot and stick of rewards. And of course, when we get that kind of flow, this is the most fertile environment for creativity. For creative thinking, as I said, to do with the creation, the novel, the fresh, original ideas, outcomes, products, artifacts. And I would say that that is one side of creativity. And the other side, of course, is that those products and outcomes are valued within the context that they are produced. Okay, so 7 pillars of creativity. And this is what I would like us to have a look at now. And these, I think, are relevant for all of us as teachers, no matter who or where we're teaching. These 7 pillars are my take on it, if you like, from the literature that I've read. So I'm sure that you'll have things that you would also like to add. So we may end up with, 21 pillars by the end of today after you've been to all the other lovely sessions at this conference. Okay, pillar number 1 is to do with building up positive self-esteem. If our learners feel insecure, if they're lacking confidence, if they don't feel that they have it in them to do the kinds of tasks and activities that we ask them to do, then this is not going to be a very conducive environment for creative thinking. And when we think of self-esteem, I think we need to think of the 5 components of self-esteem, those which are very well known, but we'll just sort of reiterate them anyway. First of all, a sense of security. Okay, I feel safe in this learning environment. A sense of identity. I know who I am here in this context. A sense of belonging. I belong here. A sense of purpose. I know why I'm doing this. And a sense of competence. Now, of course, a sense of competence, I know I can do this. Now, of course, there are masses and masses of things that we can do to promote self-esteem in a classroom context. And just things that are probably very familiar to you, the idea of think, pair, share, which was actually first developed by Paul Kagan in 1994, the idea that you give your learners an opportunity to think about something, to share it in a private context with someone next to them, with pairs, and then to share. So it gives the rehearsal opportunity. Things to do with learning routines. We know what we do in this environment. And actually, if you're familiar with the work of Jerome Bruner, learning routines not only create that feeling of safety, but also actually move learning on considerably. Things like having a negotiated contract for learning. We can also do little activities to get our learners feeling positive about themselves and their identity. So actually, before we just have a look at that, looking at this, which will be very familiar, this is Maslow's pyramid from 1943, okay, and these days, some of you have probably seen the thing going around on Facebook that has actually Wi-Fi at the bottom underneath all those needs, okay. But in a school context, physiological needs. Did the children have breakfast? Have they got water? Have they had enough sleep? Is the sun shining straight in their eyes? And so on. Safety needs. Do they feel safe in this environment? Are there rules and procedures in place to ensure safety? And of course, these days we would also include internet safety in that. Social needs. Do they feel valued? Do they feel respected? Do they feel cared about? Have they at least one friend in their environment that they're in? Esteem needs, we've talked about the 5 components of esteem. And then at the top of the pyramid, this self-actualization, which includes, of course, the creative potential. So we need to have all of these in place. And self-esteem is certainly one that we as teachers work with crucially. There's that lovely quote in Jane Arnold's book on affect that parents have the key to children's self-esteem, but teachers have a spare one. Okay. So let's have a look at a couple of activities of the kinds of things we can do. And this activity, Magic Combs, at the beginning of the year, is actually a lovely activity to do. And what this gets our students doing is thinking about the positive qualities in themselves. So what you may like to do is either give the learners or get them to draw themselves, okay, a comb with the different prongs, okay, with enough prongs for their name, okay? And then to think of their name, for example, my name's Carol, so I'm going to start with a C there, and I'm going to think of a positive adjective, positive, notice, not negative, that describes me. So I'm going to think CC, Carol, caring, maybe. Okay, so then I'm going to write it there. Okay, we don't have time to do the whole activity, but with the person next to you, could you just now think of the first letter of your name and a lovely positive adjective to describe yourself? Off you go. Off you go. Okay, if you don't mind, I'll use my tambourine to bring us back together, which I actually use with my children as well. Okay, so what we do with our lovely magic combs, we can make a beautiful display on the board and so on. And actually, if we're not feeling good about ourselves, we just get our magic combs and comb our hair, okay, and it makes us feel much better. So a little activity like that. Another generic one, which is wonderful for self-esteem, is circle time. And I would like to say here that very often, anything with circles, we're immediately thinking preschool and primary. But actually, circle time is a wonderful way of creating self-esteem, creating that sense of belonging, that sense of identity, that people are listening to you. And I'm showing you this because it is generically, it works right from preschool, where maybe we're saying, I like ice cream, or ice cream, we may even be doing it at word level, through to primary, through to secondary. For me, the worst things about global warming are ... We can also use it in a teacher education context, for example. The most important principle in teaching young learners is ... Okay, so the basic rules of circle time is that you complete a sentence and you take turns to do it round a circle. And if you've got nothing to say, you say pass. And if you can't think of what you want to say in English, you say it in your own language. And if you're doing it with children who need something physical to mark the turn-taking in the circle, then you pass a ball or something else like that around the circle. Okay, so circle time, another little activity there. So self-esteem then, pillar number 1, really important. The second pillar, model creativity yourself. This is true of any skill and quality that we want to teach or build up in others. We need to do it ourselves. It's the same, for example, with respect, with politeness in the classroom, and with creativity as well. And I think, we can actually be creative in small ways. It doesn't need to be the big creativity all the time, but a lot of the little routine things we can just add a twist to and make them a bit creative. For example, lining up in a school context. That's something that children do probably 3 or 4 times a day. Let's just give it a little extra twist. Why don't we line up in order of height, from small to tall, in order of months of birthday, in order the other way round, from tall. We can think of different ways to line up, the order of colours of the rainbow in what we're wearing, and so on. In terms of register, often we have to take the register at the beginning of our lesson. This is very time-consuming, and it can also be very boring as well. So let's make it into a little learning opportunity. A lovely one that I learnt recently was where the teacher had the register, and each student had the name of a country, okay? And when the register was read, the teacher read out the name of the countries, and the students respond with the name of the capital city, okay? And then they changed countries and moved on. So in that way, actually, taking the register became a geography lesson that children were learning the names of capitals. We could do it, for example, in our ELT context with the names of animals, and the response is the name of the baby animal. So we have horse, foal, cow, calf, and so on. We can be creative in the way that we mark our work, our children's, our learners' work. Sometimes we do it, sometimes they do it, sometimes it's self-correction, and so on. We can also be creative in the way that we get children's attention, and actually get them to be involved in the choice of how we do it. Do you prefer that I use this, or shall I just sit my mouth off? Or when I stand like this, I'm quiet, and so on. Okay. Classroom management. We can be creative in lots of different ways. Here's a little example here using a noisometer. Okay. in our classrooms, and which actually learners love this. And what happens when you do something like this is they end up being the managers of their peers rather than you. The other thing with creativity, of course, we want to have lots and lots of little creative ideas up our sleeves, as we say in English. Here's a little one now, adapted from that game. You know the one, paper, rock, scissors? Okay, this is one to do with expressions. Okay, so could I just ask everyone to show me a sad face? Sad face, lovely. Okay, could you show me a mad face? And could you show me a glad face? Okay, lovely. Now, could you just identify your partner? Okay, and just turn your back slightly to your partner. And I'm going to say, in just a moment, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and I want you to choose one of the faces and turn to your partner with that face. Everybody ready? Think of your face. Are you sad, glad, or mad? 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, lovely. So you might have three turns to see the score you get out of 3. And then, of course, actually, we might have a circle time. I feel sad because, ... I feel mad because, okay, and we could go on with that. Okay, creative activities. What I wanted to choose for this session is something that works generically at different levels. And so I'm going to show you here the idea of learning grids. These work at all different levels, except, of course, children who are too young to understand the concept of coordinates. Okay, and this I've adapted from the Griffiths and Burns book on engaging learning. And learning grids are a wonderfully flexible tool for us to use no matter who or what we're teaching. And the way that they work is like this. You work in pairs, okay, and you have a dice with numbers on, preferably ones like these, which don't clatter and make a lot of noise in the classroom. They're made out of foam or paper. Okay, and so what we do in pairs is that the learners take turns to roll the dice, one for the horizontal axis and one for the vertical axis, and they land on a square and do something with it. Now, this one is a learning grid for creating a story. Okay, and of course, before this happens, there probably will have been input of another story. For example, say, detective story genre that the learners have been working on. And so what they do is work together. They take turns to throw their dice. For example, the first learner, say, gets a 3, and the second learner throws and gets a 3. So where have they landed? Heart. So then they have to think of the opening line of their story with the word heart, or that has something to do with heart. Okay, so for example, they think together and they think, when she saw the man in the doorway, her heart stopped, for example. Okay, and then they go on. Okay, you haven't got dice, but with your partner now, would you just like to, one of you, choose a number on the horizontal axis, the other one, a number on the vertical axis, see where you land, speech bubbles, direct speech, questions, a question in the story, and make up the next sentence of the story. Okay, off you go. My tambourine not working very well. Okay. We can't spend more time on that, much as I'd love to, because we need to race on. But I think you can get the idea. And of course, your students cheat if they land on a square that they can't think of anything for their story. But I don't mind if they cheat, if actually what they're engaged in is producing the story. So learning grids, powerful for stories. They're powerful for many other ways. A little example now with learning grids used for CLIL, okay, content and language integrated learning that a lot of you are involved in, I know. And so in this grid, it would work in the same way. So once you've taught the children the idea of grids, they immediately know what to do. But here, you would land on two different bugs. Imagine that you've been doing, in your content lesson, you've been learning about different kinds of bugs, you've been classifying, you've been learning the features, and what the students would then do is land on two bugs and compare them. So it would be both the X and the Y have got wings, both the da-da-da and can fly, for example, or it could be more complicated than that. The X is good for gardens, whereas the isn't. So you can see the kind of potential there, and the task would be defined by the teacher. Okay, I want you to come up with 10 comparisons between these insects. And what happens with this grid, that in terms of motivating learning, which is all this conference is about, you have this kind of randomness in where the dice is going to land. This leads to curiosity. If everybody in the room wrote a story using the previous grid that I just showed you, all the stories would be different. So this kind of gives it an extra dimension. It also presents a challenge, okay? And the students are working together genuinely, cooperatively, and in the case of here, of course, we're recycling their knowledge and what they've learned about these little animals, but in the case of the story, they're using their imagination and creativity. Okay, so learning grids, something there. Another thing to do with generic activity types that I'm just going to show you very, very quickly is based on this game Top Trumps, okay, which I've got a little set of cards here. You can't see them, but there's some examples up there. This is a trading game that was popular in the UK years and years ago, and it's had a kind of, it's been rediscovered. And these are examples of cards actually, specifically for ELT learners. But where the creativity comes in, and these cards, by the way, there are loads of different activities that you can use with them. But what happens here is that you have various categories and criteria for each animal. In this case, for example, you have weight at birth, 113 kilos. In the game, the students divide the cards between them and a partner or within a group. They turn their cards face up and choose a category that they think is the highest. They then say, weight, 113 kilos, and if no one else has an animal which has that weight, they win all the cards. Okay, that's fine. That's a game, and you can exploit the little text. Where the creativity comes in is when we actually get our students to think of those categories and design the cards themselves. Not with all that text. You might do the text separately. But so, for example, remembering back to the bugs and insects that we looked at just a little while ago, the learners may decide the categories. Appeal, colourful, good for the garden, dangerous, and so on. And they give the ratings out of 10 and then play the game. So that can be, again, it's something that's generic. We can use it in many, many different contexts. We could use it with clothes, for example, food, all kinds of different things. But the students have that creative input. Okay, pillar number 3. We need to move on quite fast here. I hope this isn't going to make you too hungry. Pillar number 3, to do with offering choice. Okay, when our learners have choice, this not only helps to foster a sense of responsibility and to develop learner autonomy, but it also gives them a sense of ownership and a willingness to go that extra mile to be creative themselves. I like to see choice on a continuum. We can offer our students micro choices, very small choices, or macro choices, very big ones, depending on the context that we're working in. Micro choices might, for example, be to do with who we work with, not every activity, but for some, might be to do with the order that we do the tasks or activities in our lesson. If we have an activity menu, for example, that actually the students can choose the order. If we do a project with them, that they can be in charge of how they present that project. Are they going to make a poster? Are they going to use PowerPoint? And so on. Those kind of little choices. To macro choices, which most of us actually can't do most of the time. But the macro choices would be to do with actually what informs the syllabus. So if you like, those of you who are familiar with dogme, choice about the pedagogy and the curriculum. And of course, choice for those of us who work in classrooms with young learners. Choice is a very key thing in behavior management. Actually, rather than, and we avoid confrontation through using choice. For example, if students are playing around with a mobile phone that they're not supposed to be doing during this particular part of the lesson, it's not using our devices or anything like that. The typical thing for the teacher to do is go up to the child and say, you're not allowed that, give it to me now. And immediately you create a potential conflict. Of course, you're going to win because you're the teacher, you're the authority figure, but actually a much better policy is to give the child the choice. You're not allowed that. What would you like to do? Would you like to put it in your bag till the end of the lesson or give it to me? Okay. Of course, what the learner will choose to do is to put it in their bag, but you have saved face and avoided humiliation. So offering choice, a hugely important pillar. Moving on to our next pillar, and this one is so crucial, using questions effectively. As teachers, we actually tend to ask far too many questions. There's some research that says we're asking questions 70% of the time. And we also have a terrible tendency to answer our own questions because we can't bear silence. And the minute the students realize that, they know if I just wait, she'll answer it. Okay. The other thing is that the typical questions that we ask tend to be of the kind IRF, which stands for initiation, response, feedback. The kind of typical thing, what color is her jumper? Red, very good. Okay. Now that kind of question checks the color, of course, but it closes down thinking. However, we won't rule it out altogether because, as Van Leer says in his book, those kinds of questions can be really important for building confidence, for encouraging participation, particularly with our very young learners. But the important thing is that we don't want to just stick on those kinds of questions. And we need to use questions effectively to lead children to higher thinking skills. Okay, here's something very familiar for you, Bloom's taxonomy of thinking skills. From remembering and recalling at the bottom to understanding and through applying to your own context, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. And they typically tend to get divided into two types of thinking skills. We have the LOTS, okay, which stands for lower order thinking skills, and the HOTS, which stands for higher order thinking skills. Okay. And actually, we can see, these are just some examples, I'm not going to read them out, in terms of our, the tasks that we give our learners to do, the kinds of textbook materials we use. These are kind of typical words that we associate with each kind of thinking skill. Okay, so the first three, remembering, understanding, and applying, are more to do with surface, facts, and forms, whereas the higher order ones are more mentally demanding and also involve metacognition, that when we're using those kind of thinking skills, we're also engaged in thinking about our own thinking, if you like. Of course, there is overlap here, by the way. Don't think these are, rigid categories. For example, the words why and how might equally apply to analyze. But of course, the challenge for us as teachers, as language teachers, is to lead children from one kind of thinking to another. And I'd just like to show you what I mean generically in relation to a story, so that we can see how we as teachers, through the use of questions, guide our children to, or our learners rather, I keep saying children, but learners, to thinking more effectively. Okay, so at the bottom there, remember, the typical WH questions associated with recall, identification of vocabulary of what's happened in a story. Through to understand, why, what's the main idea, okay? So we lead on to that. To applying, what would you do? If you were Little Red Riding Hood, what would you do? And so on. Okay. Analyze. So a little example there. I mean, there are plenty of others. This is just a sample to show you how it might work. So classifying the characters in some particular way that's relevant to the story. Evaluating the story. Which part of the story do you like best? Why? Okay. And of course, the last kind of thinking, creating, where we create, for example, a new ending to the story. And I think it's very important for us to say here, with the advent of CLIL, with so many of us working on content and language integrated learning in our classes, there is a lot out there at the moment on developing higher order thinking skills. But we do need a balance. We have to remember we're working with foreign language learners and lower order thinking. So it sounds as if lower order, it sounds as if they're a bit inferior. But actually they are crucial and vital as well. We need a balance of both, and we need to be able to lead our learners from one to another. Another lovely way of doing this, these are actually commercial dice, but we can either make our own or these wonderful little dice that I've had for years, just with key WH questions. You don't need dice like these. You can make them using paper, but they're wonderful, for turn-taking after a story and getting learners to ask their own questions. Because us asking questions effectively is part of the story, but getting the learners to do so as well is the other part. Okay, let's move on rapidly now to making connections. Okay, making connections and seeing things differently. Okay, seeing the relationships between things, which helps to generate ideas and lead us to creative thinking. So making unusual connections. For example, a little activity that's very nice is if you have a bag with different words inside, okay, and the students take 3 words from your bag and make a connection between those words. Another very nice activity to get the connections is to get our learners thinking metaphorically, okay? And we'll just have a little go with this now. I'm going to say part of a sentence which I would like you to complete, okay? You can do it with your partner, and I'd like to hear some answers to this. Okay, a conference is like a party because... ... Off you go. Okay. Any ideas? Any ideas? Shout out. Conference is like a party because? Lovely. Fantastic. Okay, what about this one? A school is like a circus because? Off you go. Off you go. Any ideas? Any idea? Anyone willing to share an idea?
Teachers sometimes act like clowns.
Okay, wonderful. Did you hear that? Okay, school is like a circus because teachers sometimes act like clowns. Okay, wonderful. Okay, lovely metaphorical thinking. Another kind of thing that we might do, that typical activity that you even get in exams and things like that, odd one out. Okay, that odd one out one? Well, a nice way of getting learners to think, creatively is to give, for example, here, just 4 fruit flashcards, and they have to say the odd one out. This could also be linked to CLIL, if they've been learning about growing things and thinking differently. So one child might come up, a peach is the odd one out because it has a stone, not seeds. Okay? Grapes are the odd one out because they can be purple and green, okay? Strawberry is the odd one out because it's the only one with the seeds on the outside, for example. Okay, so little activities like that are promote creative thinking. And the last one of these kind of making connections, I thought I would bring this Frisbee. 20 years ago, this time 20 years ago, I was starting term at the British Council Young Learners Centre in Madrid. And I think at the end of the summer term before, somebody's bright idea had been to give all the children Frisbees with lovely British Council dots. The idea is they would play on the beaches with them over the summer and all come to classes. Okay, so we had these to give with our children. And I thought, hang on, I'm not going to just give these out. And so I followed an idea and an activity in a book, in one of Robert Fisher's books, teaching learners to think, a creative thinking idea. And I got the children, these were 7- and 8-year-olds, to think of all the things you can do with a Frisbee. Of course, this was also lovely practice of can, okay, and very good for vocabulary work because they had to use their picture dictionaries to come up with the right vocabulary. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds now, okay. How many things can you use a Frisbee for? With your partner, off you go. Okay, any ideas? Would you like to call out? Any ideas? Just call out. Plate? Okay, that's great. You've obviously got millions. Okay, we have a plate, we have a tray. Any other ideas? Just one from each? A hat, wonderful hat. Any others? A fan. Oh, yes, lovely fan. Any others? Okay, fantastic. And of course, actually, you know, our children live in the real life. So actually what my children always said was you could use it as an ashtray and you could also use it to beg. Okay, but all kinds of other things as well. And actually this activity I've done with many things since. A paperclip, a plastic cup, a coat hanger, and it produces some wonderful creative results. Here's an example here with the Frisbee, but I'm actually going to show you my very, very favorite still to this day. This is a little 7-year-old boy, and this is the idea he came up with for the Frisbee. Isn't that wonderful? Okay. And you know, that makes me think, you know, that so often our learners are so much more creative than we are. They just need those opportunities. And you know what they also need? They also need time, as this little video shows. video. I was very, very tempted to send it to my publishers recently when I was working on a project, but in the end I decided not to. But I would also say one other thing about this as well, that actually too much time can also induce lethargy. So, and actually there is nothing like a deadline for focusing the mind. So I think we need to get the balance of time there. Okay, moving on super rapidly. Pillar number 6, explore ideas and keep options open. You know, very often as teachers, we tend to jump in with our own, ideas, our own judgments, and that smothers what our students have to say. So we need to use strategies and techniques to open up their thinking. I love the idea of the can opener brainstorming with all the typical questions. You know, that Rudyard Kipling poem, I keep 6 honest serving men, they taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and where and how and who. Okay, that's still as useful today as it ever was. We can also, of course, use techniques such as mind mapping, Tony Buzan. This is something that actually, and there's also wonderful software that you can use for doing this on computers as well. And you can't just, learners need training in how to do this, but it's a very wonderful way of collecting and building up ideas together. Here's an example based on tigers, very elementary level, but I would also say for you as teacher, if you're going to do this, have a pre-prepared plan of the way the mind map will build up. You don't need to stick to it because children will have their ideas, but it will help you. And then, of course, these can be used as a prompt for, I'm not expecting you to read that, but for the children's or learners' own work. And actually using mind maps, I find, is something that some children love and respond to. I think the kind of visual spatial learners and the people who find a sort of linear order very dull, and others really don't like it at all. And it also, of course, depends on the text type that you're building up. Okay, my last pillar, encourage critical reflection. Because if we use all the kind of strategies and procedures that I've talked about to develop creativity, we're not going to get very far if we don't also train our learners to think critically and evaluate their own performance and their own outcomes. And this can be an integrated part of our activity and task cycles in lessons. I show you this very briefly up here. This is Bell Wallace. It's actually from a book on teaching kindergarten learners, but I think it's, as a model, it's applicable for whoever we're teaching. Actually, we identify the task. I'm not going to read them all out, but we go round the circle, and we always look at what have I learnt, and how well have I done, and why, and so on. That's clearly a message for me to stop that bell. I'm nearly there, if you just one moment more. Okay, another, this is an idea, a helping hand of reflective prompts. I just like the kind of the visual spatial and the kinesthetic idea of this, which, you know, you have the different questions. And of course, making it creative with our learners is when they are thinking about the reflective questions that they would like to ask themselves. Okay, so thinking of creativity and bringing this all together, in Robert Fisher's book on teaching thinking skills, which I've mentioned already, he has a lovely recipe for a happy class, okay, which you can, I'm afraid it's slightly small, but you can probably see it there. You can see the ingredients and you can see the method. And I just love, you know, that the child has put there 1 kilo of discipline. That's what they actually want, okay? And also, I love one really nice teacher graded, you know, so that everybody gets a fair share of the teacher. Something else that's very important. Well, the reason I wanted to show you this is because creativity in a teacher education context is also very important. Every year, actually for the last 20 years, I've run a primary teacher education course for the British Council in Paris. And when we get on to the session, lesson planning, myself and my colleague, Gail Ellis, the obvious task is to get our teachers to plan a lesson using the principles that we've taught them throughout the week. However, that's a really, you can see people's faces, oh no, we don't want to do that. Why? Because there's not a real class that we're planning for, and also because we all have slightly different takes. And so what we've come up with is a task where actually they think of a recipe, a creative recipe for teaching effectively and creatively. And I would just like to show you an example of one of these now, which is delicious lasagna, delicious lesson lasagna. So would you like to look at the wonderful ingredients there? Chop challenge, isn't it wonderful? Okay, and you can see the method for making this delicious lasagna. Okay, bake golden brown, the final thing, and serve with kindness and understanding. Okay, so actually my final message to you this morning is whatever lesson recipes you cook up creatively for your children, your learners, whoever it is you're teaching, make sure that they're creative and delicious. Thank you very much.